Hello and welcome to the first lecture from Lorehold College. I'm Dr. Carina Hart and I specialise in folklore and literary history. And I'm interested in the way that certain stories are told and retold over time, preserving certain ideas and changing or jettisoning others. Folklore in particular blurs the boundary between history and fiction, calling into question the idea that there is a clear divide between them. Now, I'm here to argue for Lorehold's white approach to knowledge and history, hence the white, which sees knowledge as a tradition to be preserved, mastered, and then added to. But not everyone in Lorehold agrees with that definition, and so that is the debate that we will be having today.
Hi there, my name is Dr. Joe Jackson, and I'm a scholar of contemporary literature. But if you want to understand the present, you have to understand the past. History is very important to the work I do, all the way back, for example, to the very beginning of Britain itself. Plus, added bonus, I'm also a long-standing Magic the Gathering player, all the way back through history. I think my first booster pack was Antiquities. I think one of the few outside of the more science-oriented academic subjects. I've got at least one very important thing in common with the dust speakers of Lorehold, a recognition that you get more out of the past by bashing it up, by refusing to observe the piety and reverence we often direct at historical figures or historical moments. So I'm here to represent that element of Lorehold, the red dimension of chaos, of inspiration, absurdity, irreverence, and of experience.
So we will begin by setting out the idea of dialectics, which will govern this debate, and which is also central to the workings of Lorehold College. And that will lead us into a discussion of the opposition between order and chaos. We will then talk about the university, and in particular the library, what it's for and how we should use the knowledge and the books in the library. Next, we'll discuss Lorehold's work with spirits, statues, and sites of excavation, which are both opposed to each other and fundamentally connected. And finally, that will take us into a debate on the nature of heroes and their place in history. So that's what we will cover in this lecture, and we'll take questions at the end. Please feel free to type the questions in and we will answer them at the end.
Okay, so let's now spend a moment introducing the concept of a dialectic. This is a bit of a cleaned up version, but I think we are going to hit most of the important targets. Dialectics are a kind of meeting point between, for example, 2 points of view, 2 ideas. Today we're going to present something of a dialectic in our analysis of Lorehold, our 2 representations of Lorehold. Ideally, the people participating in such a discussion share a common goal. That common goal to come to a better understanding of something. A more formal way of explaining a dialectic is in the combination of 2 contradictory positions. So, one is the thesis or the abstract, the other is the antithesis or the negative. These come together to form the synthesis or the concrete. Once you've bashed these, you're left, you've shaken them out, you're left with a new resolved understanding. It's a process of an evolution of knowledge rather than, say, a transcendental truth or authority, didacticism, teaching people directly. Now, the colleges of Strixhaven are premised on exactly that idea, on a dialectic combination of 2 contradictory positions. In Lorehold, we can illustrate this with reference to our well-respected deans, Plarg, Dean of Chaos, and Augusta, Dean of Order. You can clearly see that today we have modelled our respective looks on our glorious deans. Me, resplendent and ordered like Augusta. Dr. Hart, with full-scale lockdown hair. taking the role of Clark. So in our talk, we'd like to reflect a little bit on the contradictory qualities and prevailing symbols of order and chaos in Lorehold College and how they help us to illuminate history. Let's go with the Biblioplex.
So we might illustrate the idea of order and chaos with reference to Strixhaven itself, or to the idea of the university. And I think everyone will recognise that on the one hand, universities are august institutions. They are historical. The earliest universities date back hundreds of years, if not 1,000. And universities are a symbol of civilization, of scholarly inquiry, of knowledge as an ideal. Universities are a bastion of stability, not chaos, on which civil society itself has been founded. They are governed by tradition, and their reputations are hard won. And that's why a university degree is worth what it is, because it carries with it the weight of history, carried by the awarding institution.
Listen, it's undeniable that universities are old, and they contain a lot of old things. Books, professors, certain ideas. But universities must also be distinguished as spaces of experimentation, of dynamic discovery, of novelty. They enjoy special protected characteristics in that sense too. Knowledge as an ideal, it might sound like a philosophical aspiration as something quite abstract, but it has practical consequences as well. Protecting universities as spaces of inquiry mean you can find weird and wonderful things that aren't serving someone's interest on the outside, perhaps. Universities are frontier spaces. They're wild and unpredictable and unexpected.
Well, you can judge that for yourselves at Strixhaven. Now, new Mage students at Strixhaven University will have already begun exploring the Biblioplex, the library at the heart of the university. At least, I hope they've been doing some reading. Now, imagine trying to find something in the Biblioplex if there was no catalogue and no system for ordering the books. You'd never find what you were looking for. It would be impossible. Having structures and system is not about controlling knowledge or keeping it away from people. It's exactly the opposite. The system makes the whole world of knowledge available to everyone, or at least everyone lucky and talented enough to have a place at Strixhaven University.
Well, I'm glad you made reference to the Biblioplex. On the surface, it does cater to fantasies of careful preservation and systematization. But don't be mistaken for thinking that libraries are calm and ordered places, or that we would even necessarily want them to be. A Lorehold Chaos scholar, who's myself, would tell you that you're quite likely to find something vital in a library by accident, by sheer chance, that advances your understanding. Maybe something catches your eye that you wouldn't otherwise have noticed. Maybe the book you really wanted to obtain is missing. It's been pawned off by some down-at-heel undergraduate student, and instead you stumble on the book you really need. A perfectly ordered world doesn't admit chances to stir up the hornet's nest.
Okay, so it's all very well to celebrate the spontaneity of finding that unexpected inspirational book. But why do you think that particular perfect book was there just where you happened to be looking for it? It's because of the system, the library classification system that orders together books on the same subject. That's why that perfect book is there in front of you. So the ordering of the library is precisely what sets up the kind of serendipitous discoveries that you chaos scholars get so excited about.
I'm going to pull rank here. We Magic players, we know that libraries can't be ordered. They have to be randomized. There's a reason we don't play with a stacked deck. What kind of a game would that be? I tell you, the Dewey Decimal System is a cheater's charter.
What kind of game would it be if there were no rules at all, and no ordering of cards and ordering of moves? It wouldn't be a game at all. It would be a room full of loons hurling cards at each other.
I see you've been to a magic tournament before, badunch.
Okay, rule breaking is no fun if there are no rules to begin with. So remember that the anarchy and innovation that you chaos folks value relies entirely on the order that it pushes up against.
Okay. Let's move on.
Okay, something a little different. So, and you can see from this slide where we're going to begin to go with this. Now, let me show you what I mean when I talk about knowledge as a tradition that is gradually added to. We'll use an example. So my research looks at the intersections of folklore, literature, and history, studying how narratives, symbols, ideas are changed and adapted as they come down through history. And I would describe this as a kind of dynamic preservation, a respect for text and history that is not constrained or fixed. Folklore is not a glass box in a museum, but a living ritual that imbues ancient stories and ideas with spirit, making them speak to the here and now.
You can see she's a Lorehold scholar. Please, carry on.
I'll take that as a compliment. The example I'd like to use is the tale of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, or perhaps it's better described as a tale tradition. And as the title suggests, it's a particularly relevant example for the mage students of Strixhaven. We might even see it as a cautionary tale, so I hope you're listening at the back there. So the oldest known version of this tale comes from ancient Greece in the tale of Eucrates, who recounts how in his youth, studying under an Egyptian scribe who's learned in magic, he finds himself left alone and decides to have a go at using his tutor's magic. He speaks the spell to animate a wooden pestle, like from a pestle and mortar, and the pestle takes the form of a man and goes to collect water. So it keeps coming back and pouring water into the house, which is flooding dangerously because the Sorcerer's Apprentice doesn't know the counterspell. And the moral of the story, of course, is that the arrogant, anarchic young apprentice causes chaos that he can't control by summoning spirits before he has learned how to deal with them.
It's ironic, of course, that what he wants is a counterspell. There's a lot of water sloshing around. That's plenty of blue mana.
If only he'd known that. But you might be thinking that this tale of the uncontrollable pestle reminds you of something similar, maybe with a broom animated by unruly spirits. And that's because this tale has been retold in Disney's 1940 animation Fantasia, with Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. There have been many retellings, and another one, so a poem from 1797 by the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This also has the student animating a broom with spirits. So my interpretation of this aspect of the tale is that it's significant that the Sorcerer's Apprentice is trying to use magic to tidy up, right? He's enchanting a broom, which indicates his awareness that magical learning is about order, and he is trying to restore order to his world by tidying up. The lazy way, but still trying to tidy up. But without the proper reverence for the spells he casts and the spirits he summons, and without full mastery of the ancient traditions he's channeling, he can only create more chaos. And this chaos is destructive rather than creative. So chaos isn't always good. We all know that. Now, since Lorehold is concerned with the careful study of written texts, let's take a quick look at Goethe's poem and see what else it can tell us about the conflict between order and chaos, and the importance of respecting ancient traditions. So the poem begins like this, in the voice of the apprentice. That old sorcerer has vanished and for once has gone away. Spirits called by him, now banished, my commands shall soon obey. Every step and saying that he used, I know, and with sprites obeying, my arts I will show. Now this opening of the poem describes the raising of spirits through the words of a spell, and the apprentice demonstrates his arrogance and egotism in the statement that he will show his own arts by making the spirits obey him. So the theme of selfish and disrespectful use of magical tradition is clearly established at the beginning of the poem, and we can all guess where it will lead. Not long after, the apprentice realises, says, "Master's word I have forgotten. Ah, the word with which the master makes the broom a broom once more." So his partial knowledge of the magical tradition means that the apprentice doesn't know the counterspell, and so the enchanted broom keeps bringing buckets of water, pouring them into the house, which is starting to flood. And by the time it gets kind of up to his chin, he needs to call for help. But this idea of the word, or the word, is emphasised through repetition in that part of the poem, as is the word master, indicating the apprentice's own lack of mastery. And he ends in humiliation by having to call for help. So he says, "Lord and master, hear me crying. Ah, he comes excited. Sir, my need is sore. Spirits that I've sighted, my commands ignore." And now the tradition of the sorcerer's apprentice is not just in Goethe's poem, it's all over the place, including in texts that you might be already familiar with. So, for instance, tales of Faust, sometimes known as Faustus. In this tale, folklore intersects with history and literature, as legends of this ill-fated German magician have always been argued by some to be based on a real person. And the tale is often retold in literature particularly, and you might have studied Christopher Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus at your non-magical school. So in this tale, Faust signs away his soul to the devil in exchange for magical knowledge and power. But without proper respect for these magical powers, he finds that he cannot do anything of real value with them, and his spells become more and more trivial. And thinking about the Lorehold specialism of raising the spirits of the past to enlighten us, there is something similar in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. He reanimates Helen of Troy. But how does this selfish, disrespectful mage make use of her presence? Yeah, he wants to get off with her. And his punishment is an eternity of suffering in hell, so take note, young mage students. Now, another familiar literary branch of this tradition is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that you might also know very well, in which the iconoclastic student Victor Frankenstein reanimates the dead in a patchwork of body parts, really an embodiment of chaos and anarchy. But he hasn't planned how to deal with the life that he has created, so it goes on a murderous rampage and kills his nearest and dearest. We're really getting a theme emerging. Again and again, we see apprentices going wild with ancient texts, ripping up the rulebook, and calling a world of chaos upon their heads. And
sounds great.
We end up back at Magic the Gathering with the Sorcerer's Broom card from Throne of Eldraine. Here, the replicating nature of the broom is emphasised and is repurposed for the battlefield. So the fact that when the apprentice cuts the broom in half to try and end the spell, he just creates two magical brooms going crazy. So the broom replicates. And this is reflected in the card itself that you can see on the slide, that it's a replicating card. But the flavour text indicates the traditional fairy tale warning to be careful what you wish for. So the Fae King smiled. He knows that it's all going to go wrong. So overall, this tale tradition emphasises the dialectical nature of learning and knowledge, in which interaction with a teacher is essential to the pupil's acquisition of knowledge and mastery. Merely knowing the words of a spell isn't enough. You need to learn how to use it in the context of the spell's effects, side effects, and counterspells. So when you next go to the Biblioplex, remember that the books and scrolls and manuscripts are there to guide you in an adventure that might not seem as exciting as venturing into a ruined castle to summon a long-dead spirit. But nonetheless, it is an adventure into a world of knowledge that will speak to you in many voices, guiding you towards infinite achievements. You just have to learn it properly first.
All this talk of reverence for books, and that they can't provide you with some adventure. Au contraire. That's one of the dead languages that we in Lorehold are very interested in studying. Books can provide you with a bit of unexpected adventure. It is my memory of Fantasia that there is a real emphasis on reverence towards the book. The books can only be approached by the right people. But what we see here with our enthusiastic student is perhaps a more lateral approach to the use of books. If the pen is mightier than the sword, just think what a giant tome could do. Okay, I'm not really advocating for using books as weapons, even if a really big one might give someone a nasty bang on the head. The pen is only mightier than the sword in a figurative sense. There are many situations where, frankly, you'd rather have a sword. But it's worth thinking about the way that books are or are not useful as tools, like a sword is a tool, and like the enthusiastic student is wielding the giant tome as a tool. A Lorehold conservator or curator approaches a book as an object for protection, something that has to be kept under lock and key. You'd be forgiven for thinking they'd like nothing more than to throw away said key and keep the books forever protected from the grubby hands of young scholars, undergraduates, and postgraduates.
All the students.
All the students. But books are there to be used, to be useful. Without the spark of engagement, they really are dead scrolls. They really are only really useful for bashing people with as paperweights. I often have entertaining back and forths with my own students, in which I encourage them to ravage this week's paperback, inking it, folding it, bending it, wedging it. Actually, I even have this novel I teach, in which some of the prose is jammed so far into the printable area of the page that you literally have to break it open in order to read it, in order to get the meaning out. That does make the students a little bit uncomfortable. Listen, ancient things are fragile. They need care and attention. I'm not suggesting you want to scribble your latest musings in the margins of the Dead Sea Scrolls or your local copy of Shakespeare's First Folio. No. But taking a too reverential approach to books is limiting. If you don't break the spine of a book, you're never going to get the wisdom out of it. If you approach books as mystical, as sacred, really as aesthetic objects, and recoil in horror at the prospect of annotating your own ideas, your own critical insights onto the pages of a novel, onto the pages of a book of reference, a book of nonfiction, you're missing out on some of the most important ways that books are purposeful. Perhaps our enthusiastic student with the giant tome is onto something, that we should see books as tools that can achieve ends for us. Just not braining your rivals for the class prize.
And that's a nice idea for your own books, sure. But the Biblioplex is for the whole Strixhaven community. And if everyone scribbled their ideas over the pages, the books would soon become totally unreadable. That said, it's a misinterpretation to say that the ordered side of Lorehold is all about static authoritarian texts and knowledge. It's about reverence for traditions of knowledge that are there for us to gradually master and add to. So, we ordered scholars might not be scrawling our badly thought out notions over the pages of ancient texts. Instead, we're cultivating our own original contributions to knowledge and eventually publishing them to take their place in the Biblioplex, where they can be located and used properly by everyone.
I tell you what, though, we all really secretly know that when we open a reference book and find that somebody's made some notes for us, it's great.
It really depends on the quality of the notes. Okay, so now I've spoken about the way white scholars at Lorehold engage with written texts and respect historical traditions. But it isn't all about reading and writing. We do get up close and personal with history as well. Yes, we do. And what we really want is to speak to the great people of the past, to see history through the eyes of those whose statues adorn our campus. So at Lorehold, we are concerned with studying and manipulating the relationship between ethereal spirit and concrete form, specialising in the animation of stone statues, you can see on the slide, and monuments. Statues in particular represent the ubiquitous desire to immortalise the greatness of an individual, to make their fleeting lives and impermanent bodies into something lasting. Now at Lorehold, we strive for an even more complete immortality, to return the spirits of the past to the stone effigies of their former bodies and commune with them, acquiring the knowledge and wisdom that never got written down. But in doing this, we tamper with the fundamental laws of time and matter, and we risk destroying all our work with the sheer power of our magic. Our chaos scholars, unfortunately, tend to push things too far in that direction. So why is jumping recklessly into history so much better than carefully studying it, Dr. Jackson?
Well, simply because experience is an important mode of gaining knowledge. We know that one of the key ambitions of Lorehold scholars is to get out there and do history. That's the main use of archaeomancy, after all. In one sense, this reflects the spirit of adventurous inquiry that has animated archaeologists through history. You can imagine an archaeomancer, right, coming in pretty useful when you want to shift the massive stone block that is precluding you accessing that ancient pharaoh's temple in the Valley of the Kings.
I mean, you could use a forklift or something.
That's not very magical, Dr. Hart. This is obviously strictly for historical inquiry. It's not for tomb robbing. Perhaps if we had a little more divining archaeomagic, we would be able to locate the resting place of the fabled Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the ancient world, that is, something that I think will be quite close to the hearts of Lorehold scholars. But there are actually some real-world equivalents, if you like, maybe that's a bit adventurous, but I'm going to go with it, to archaeomancy in what I would describe as radical archaeology, ways of conjuring the magic of the past and of history that are not spade work, trowel work. Experimental archaeology involves physically reconstructing the past in the present. If you can't work out how those ancient Mesopotamians built that particularly impressive ziggurat, see if you can build it yourself using technologies from 3000 BC. Experiential archaeology is similar. It involves the reconstruction of lived experience of the past. If you want to connect with the day-to-day lives of the Neolithic people of the Orkney Islands, get yourself some stone tools, a fishing rod, a couple of domesticated animals, and go and live in a turf-roofed hut for a few weeks.
Whatever floats your boat. I'm not giving that essay an A.
What about performance archaeology? It takes it even further. It places would-be archaeologists on the stage and puts in their hands the musical instruments, the play scripts, the dancing shoes. Okay, it probably puts the dancing shoes on their feet. Of ancient civilizations, it combines the academic dimension of archaeology with the artistic, the aesthetics we bring to our imagination and representation of the past. So in the sense of doing history, history is an adventure, one that emphasizes the empirical nature of knowledge. That's a technical term. Empirical nature, knowledge based on observation or on experience. It's not just a quirk of Lorehold excavators, but it's a crucial element of actual archaeological inquiry.
Okay. Let me remind you of this line from the Strixhaven prospectus. Walk down Effigy Row on the Lorehold campus. It's lined with monuments to historical scholars, war heroes, and heads of state. As people like you, with your predilection for smashing things up, that have caused wonders like the Colossus to be lost. Without the orderly monuments in places like Effigy Row, great heroes and their deeds would be forgotten. And without carefully preserved written texts, would we even know that the Colossus had existed? But this is where the red and white must come together. We need to work together. I will admit that us dust speakers of Lorehold sometimes need a little extra crackle of power to get out there and raise the full spirit of the past. Otherwise, we could spend all our days reading about statues and monuments coming to life. I know I could, without actually going out to summon their spirits and speak to them. And although you might not yet have taken any lessons in communing with the spirits of stones and statues, their voices have always been around you. For instance, there are many ancient British tales of standing stones, like Stonehenge, right, whose spirits command the respect that we would give to them in the white faction of Lorehold, and for good reason. Many of these monumental standing stones bring bad luck on anyone who dares to move them or mess with them, such as the Rollright stones in England. And there is a tale to do with these stones of a local farmer who took one stone to use on his farm, but was then beset by bad luck. His cattle died, his crops failed, he had to sell almost everything he owned, until he returned the stone to its rightful place and his own prosperity returned. And there are loads of tales like this, not just in Britain, but throughout Europe. And really, there is no question of the tradition and the truth within that tradition of the need for respecting ancient monuments and statues. So in tales like this, we see the same emphasis on respect and reverence for ancient magic that we saw in the tale tradition of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, supporting our own position on the white side of Lorehold. After all, who knows what will befall you if you disrespect the relics of the past? And this we can see in the specialism of Lorehold in summoning and communicating with the spirits using statues as a conduit. So moving from standing stones to statues, there is a long tradition of stories about statues coming to life. And one of the best known of these is the ancient Greek story of Pygmalion, a sculptor who falls in love with the ivory statue of a woman he's made. And after making offerings to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, she brings the statue to life and Pygmalion marries her. It's very convenient. And this tale is an early catalyst for a whole history of narratives in which a man creates a perfect artificial woman who then comes to life. Other examples include E.T.A. Hoffmann's creepy 1816 story, The Sandman, which you might also be familiar with, which features a young man falling in love with a beautiful girl who turns out to be a clockwork automaton, but whose appearance of life fools everyone. We might also think of Shakespeare's play The Winter's Tale, in which Hermione dies after her jealous husband imprisons her on a false accusation of infidelity. Decades later, he is brought to remorse on seeing a beautiful statue of Hermione, which then comes to life as a reward for his remorse. Except, of course, it really is Hermione who hadn't died after all. She just kind of hung about for 25 years, hoping for better things. But this, not recommended. This leads us to question the whole notion of a statue from a philosophical perspective. Does the static and reverent nature of statues create a culture of impossible ideas? So we really see that in these statues or automata of beautiful women, impossible ideals, right? Do statues represent a perfection that can't possibly exist or can't possibly have really existed in history? And what if the heroes immortalized in statuary and scrolls were not really worthy of that honour? What if someone recorded the version of history that suited them and buried contradictory evidence or alternative perspectives?
You'll be happy to know that we on the red side of Lorehold have an answer for you.
That's great. This is why red and white work together at Lorehold as best we can. And this is where Dr. Jackson's iconoclastic approach may have some value. Some value. People often think of history and fiction as opposite kinds of text. History is true, fiction is invented. But they are both narratives. They're stories that are told, and they're both written by fallible people with their own viewpoints and biases. Dr. Jackson, tell me then, how can we better harness the powers of chaos to ultimately bring history into better order?
I'm glad you've asked me that. And I'd like to call everyone's attention back to a comment you made a moment ago on the subject of individuals worthy of statuary and the burying of contradictory evidence. Many people may recognize this gentleman. But I'm not going to start with Shakespeare. I'm going to start with Shelley. One of the most famous literary works dedicated to the commemorative statue is the magnificent sonnet from Percy Shelley, Ozymandias. Normally I just give a précis, but it's a short poem, and I think you get the full force of it pretty quickly. So here goes. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So Shelley's poem is, if you like, an archaeological meditation on history, on the way all great figures are torn down by the ceaseless action of sands, of the wind, of the tides, of the march of time. The hubris of the great pharaoh Ozymandias, he's probably Ramesses II of Egypt, is exposed by the sharp contradiction in the poem, the injunction to look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair, stuck on a pair of disembodied legs. Of course, that just means some of our Lorehold brethren will be along in a minute to dig it up and put it back together again. But let's stick with Shelley's main motif for now. Ozymandias' undoubted greatness, historical greatness, is the object of Shelley's deserved scorn. Walk down Effigy Road on the Lorehold campus, as Dr. Hart has suggested. It's lined with monuments to historical scholars, war heroes, and heads of state. Heads of state like Ozymandias. It's not hard to find folks in the college whose stock in trade is veneration, apologia of those lofty figures from the past. But there's also a fine tradition of hero scorning in the college, along the same lines as Shelley's takedown of Ozymandias and his legacy. Hero scorners attack the burnished image of the past, foregrounding the frailties, the moral failings, the inconvenient realities about these figures. The practice of hero scorning in Lorehold, it quite simply provides the antithesis to what these honour bringers do, what these people over on the white side of things do, the ritualised or dogmatic worship of heroes. Unquestioned hero worship is a means of tying ourselves to a false version of the past, lying about history. And it equally involves imposing a vision on the present that can promote certain values or certain interests. Hero scorning is a way of helping us to get to a greater truth. It's a way of stress testing the legacy of figures from the past. Now, let me take another useful example of something closely regarded to our research interests: Shakespeare. It's hard to imagine a cultural figure that has been more heroized than William Shakespeare. Considering he was a relatively little known figure 400 years ago, a substantial legend has been built up on the basis of some fairly shaky history. And that legend isn't passive. There's a huge academic industry built on Shakespeare. There's a huge national mythology built on Shakespeare. Academics who cast doubt on historical interpretations of Shakespeare's life do so in the teeth of some pretty strong opposition to changing anything about our story of the man. There's even a word for this practice: bardolatry. It's a portmanteau term that combines the bard, Shakespeare, idolatry, the worship of idols.
Of course, some of this opposition these hero scorners receive is down to their lack of evidence, lack of logic in their arguments.
I'm coming to that.
There's that.
I'm coming to that.
Oh, okay.
See, this is where our hero scorners kick into action. They pick holes in the myth. They ask the difficult questions. They open up what seems to be closed for new analysis, for new reflection. Did Shakespeare, for example, write all of the plays to which his name is attached, historically or by contemporary enthusiastic scholars? Was he a great originator of ideas, or did he make liberal use of an earlier history? Is Romeo and Juliet really the model of romantic love we want to promulgate as an ideal? The answers to these questions might not be in keeping with the idealized legend of Shakespeare, but hero scorners address themselves to challenging those legends, those comfortable legends, to find a deeper truth. And of course, the example of Shakespeare throws up another tradition of thought in Lorehold, the one that I think my esteemed colleague Dr. Hart was alluding to a moment ago. Conspiracy theorists. There are some under-evidenced claims out there when it comes to the authorship of Shakespeare's works. Were they actually written by Sir Francis Bacon? Or the Earl of Oxford? Or maybe Christopher Marlowe? Chances are slim. Although each of these has its enthusiastic backers. But I want to claim, quite radically, that even conspiracy theorists have their place. They force us to understand how consensual knowledge is produced, how we agree on the things we know to be true, what our shared understanding of truth is, and how we can best articulate it and defend it.
Yeah. Okay. But you still need us lot to help keep those conspiracy theorists from taking over. I'm sure you will agree with me on that. Okay. Joe and I are scholars of literature primarily, but we're comfortable operating under the auspices of Lorehold College because we see what we do as immutably a part of history. And the next talk you're going to hear from the college is going to address just that question, the role of lore itself, of storytelling as a kind of knowledge. We can't wait for that. And what we want to leave you with is the idea of history itself as a form of storytelling. And the pioneering and controversial historian Hayden White made his name through arguing that history as a discipline is a kind of narration. He didn't deny that there were historical facts, right, like documents, annals, ledgers, material objects dug out of tombs by intrepid Lorehold archaeomancers, statues with inscriptions, runes, hieroglyphs. Yes, they're all there. But those historical facts alone are thin and open to a huge variety of interpretations. History the story, has to be written from them. And any act of writing, even one ostensibly dedicated to establishing some truth, involves questions like ordering, inclusion and omission, tone and emphasis. And this is where we might bring dialectics back in, thinking about history not as a dry assembly of material evidence and intermittent records, but as a dynamic system of ideas in tension with each other, in which the encounter between competing interpretations of the historical record produces new knowledge and helps move us towards a more complete understanding. And that's what the order and the chaos of Lorehold College is good for. So thank you very much for your time, and we will look forward to taking some questions.
Yeah, so I think the system we're going to use for receiving and answering questions is via Discord. I do have my Discord server to my left hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through the questions one by one. I'm going to read out the name and the question. I'll probably make Dr. Hart answer them all because she's very competent. Does that sound like a good proposal?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer all the questions about Magic the Gathering. Yeah.
Oh. That might be difficult. Right. So, the fresh price of Evangelion. Question: how can people learn about folklore and apply it from academia to industry? Now, fortunately for me, anything that has the word folklore in it automatically gets passed to my right, to the folklore specialist sitting there. So, Dr. Hart, what implications do you think folklore has in industry, in commerce, for example?
That is a really interesting question, not one I'd anticipated. I mean, thinking about the application of folklore is, of course, something that we do in folklore studies. The application to industry is another thing. I guess it depends what kind of industry we're thinking about. So the heritage industry is quite an easy one. So, that's places like museums and national trust houses, and like Stonehenge itself and the industry that's built up around it, as well as the kinds of books, publications, talks, events that go alongside these kinds of places and objects. And there is a real public interest and kind of public value in folklore. People are always interested in these things, and so applying academic rigor and research to the heritage industry is a good way of making sure that the information and interpretation and histories out there are good ones. So if you're interested in folklore and you've done a bit of internet surfing, you'll find all sorts of things, lots of very interesting things, but often it's not at all clear where stories and ideas have come from and if they're backed up by any evidence. There's also this fact that folklore is continually being created. So I have colleagues in folklore studies who actually use the internet as data. So they use like online communities and forums and the stories and folklore that emerge from them as an object of study. So folklore is still being created and is still happening. But that means that it can be anything. It's very difficult to draw the boundaries of the discipline, the boundaries of folklore, and where something is something worth study and consideration and where it's just something that some randomer made up on the internet. That's the difficulty in this day and age, right?
Let me come in, because I actually have a couple of ideas myself.
Oh, you do you?
Yeah. Okay. And needless to say, I'm needing to abandon I'm not particularly chaotic, so these may not come across necessarily as representative of the chaotic position. So I suppose one of the things that we often encourage our students to think about in terms of what they might do after they graduate is the way that storytelling is useful for example, in relation to products, right?
Yeah.
So marketing is a big part of the way that knowing how to tell a story is what we call a transferable skill, something that can be applied. Now, the reason why folk tales particularly are quite important in that context, I would venture, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hart, is that they are a kind of common story, right? They because of their, by virtue of their folk-like quality, like Red Riding Hood or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or what have you, they're stories that everybody recognizes. And that means they can be counted on as a kind of common language.
Yeah.
And that makes them very effective for telling a story, say, about the car that you want to sell.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is absolutely true. And that's something that goes for kind of literary studies and folklore studies, and I think history as well, because the three disciplines really do cross over a lot. I'm trying to think about other industries in which you could apply folklore, kind of less obvious ones. And I think that idea of a common ground of knowledge, but also the structures of storytelling. So many of the ways that we understand a story to work, a beginning, middle, and an end, and what those should look like, that's used in all kinds of things. It's used in, like in science, maybe not quite an industry, but the story of the Big Bang. A story had to be written to make sense of the available evidence. So I think probably shouldn't spend too long thinking about every industry under the sun. But yeah, it's in terms of common knowledge, structures of storytelling, and the constantly newly created and recreated dynamics of folk understanding and knowledge.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Let's move on to our next question. It's from Raquel Teixeira. How do you think order and chaos are linked to the personality of people and characters? Do you think this characteristic affects how they think, learn, and act? Let me start answering that one, and then you can come in, right?
I did start the last one.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, one thing I would say is that in the context of what is quite an ordered world like magic, we do associate big archetypes, big kind of characteristic archetypes with individuals, right? We know that certain characters are associated with order. We know that certain characters are associated with chaos. Just look at the examples of Augusta and Plarg. They are defined by their relationship with order and chaos. So I think the ability to hook individuals, characters to these kinds of archetypes is really helpful for building a game. And it's really helpful for telling a story. It's really helpful for telling a story that has a moral, perhaps. But if we're really honest about people as they actually are in the world, they don't quite translate as cleanly to order and to chaos. We all have our reverence for certain kinds of order. And we all, I think, like to partake of chaos in one way or another. I don't know whether you have anything to add to that, Dr.
Yeah, that really kind of intersects with what I was thinking. So I think yes, there is an element of personal inclination one way or the other. I think also kind of conditioning, so the way people have been brought up, what kind of society or family they've been in, will affect whether they are steered more towards chaos and order. But I think within that, there is not necessarily this clear divide between chaos and order, and it's not always obvious which is happening. So I'm thinking within the arts, so within experimental literature or maybe jazz music, they can seem very chaotic, like they're kind of random and all over the place. But actually, to create that kind of art, you need a real tight mastery of the craft and techniques and the structures of the art form. So you can't do an experimental sonnet if you don't understand the sonnet form and the way that it's ordered. So I would say that this is why order and chaos, they do really work together, and they need to work together, and there isn't always this clear opposition between them.
Thanks for that, Dr. Hart. Okay, so we've got questions coming thick and fast in the next little missive that's been sent to me. Let me try and distill it, and I think this comes from a combination of people from The Strange Eli and from 20 Tourniquet 02. And it's about the Library of Alexandria. Now, Dr. Hart might not know this, but the Library of Alexandria is a phenomenally powerful Magic the Gathering card, as well as a very important historical
Of course
library.
I knew that.
You know that it burned down, of course. So the force of the question here is, how could such a library be reanimated if we have nothing left from it? How do you rebuild the Library of Alexandria after it's been burned down?
Is it true that we have nothing left of it?
It's provocative.
What's a memory, you know?
Well, we probably don't have any memories of it because it was quite a few years ago. I don't think anybody alive today ever set eyes on the Library of Alexandria.
Maybe this is where we need experiential and experimental archaeologists to recreate the Library of Alexandria with evidence from around the wider context.
Well, I think it's actually quite an interesting question. It's a really interesting question, and it's got some real contemporary application. So, speaking as a Glaswegian, we recently saw the cherished Charles Rennie Mackintosh Library in Glasgow School of Art burn down. I have never wept over a news report as I wept over the burning of that library. And this was precisely the question posed then. How should it be rebuilt? Should it be rebuilt in its entirety, piece by piece, in an exact replica? Or should it be rebuilt in a modern style, kind of riffing or playing on the past, Charles Rennie Mackintosh's past? Now, you'd be surprised how many architects are strongly in favour of the latter option. Reproducing the past in toto, in exactitude, is seen as Philistine, barbarian, crass, immoral. Although for many of us, I think our first reaction would be, please rebuild it as it was. Mm. Now, if we think about the example of the Library of Alexandria, you're right, Dr. Hart. It's not completely gone. There isn't that nothing remains of it, because we know about it. There must be archaeological traces. We could, I think, conceivably try to totalize the world codified knowledge of that historical moment and reproduce it. We could really be equipped to do that in a contemporary sense because we've got digitization, right? So you could rebuild a kind of virtual Library of Alexandria. But here's an example you might want to talk about. The Globe Theatre, which also burned down and was rebuilt. Now, has that been a success or a failure, do you think?
Do you know what? I've never been there. That's bad, isn't it?
It's a terrible confession.
I know.
What would the Shakespeareans among us think of that?
Fortunately, I'm not a Shakespearean. I think I was actually thinking of a different example of, so in various kind of tourist sites around the world, you do get replicated historical buildings. So like the Royal Palace in Myanmar, formerly Burma, there's a total recreation, and in South Korea, in Seoul as well. But what they're lacking, and this is very much a Lorehold point to make, is the spirit of the place. It's just not the same. That's maybe not a very academic kind of point to make, but I think it's true. So I think you have to bring in something of the present and some kind of purpose and thought from the present that is in dialogue with the past that you're trying to recreate, for it to be more than just a simulacrum, like an empty attempt to replicate something that is gone.
Thanks for that. Okay, let's move on to asking a question about statues. You like statues. I like statues. Do statues need to be built around the time the spirit of the personality you're trying to conjure was alive or close to their death? Or will any statue do? I mean, I think this is a question for Lorehold, isn't it? It's a Lorehold question.
These are such good questions. I think that however it's done, whenever a statue is built, will affect how the outcome, the nature of the statue, and how people respond to it. I'm not sure I would say it should be done in a certain way, but the context in which a statue is built and erected needs to be taken account of. And this is kind of how we approach everything in our academic study, really, certainly within the kind of literary studies that we work in. We don't look at things on their own. The context from which they emerged will always have affected the particular nature of this piece that's been created. So, I mean, if you think about, like, you know, the statue in Bristol of the slave owner that was torn down. Exactly, yeah. It's from a different time, and you couldn't erect a statue of somebody like that in this time without taking account of the completely different context and way that we think about the time in which he lived.
Yeah, I think the kind of dusty layer that history puts on things is very important, isn't it? It's a bit like when you go to a museum and you look at the exhibits and you find out that some of the exhibits have been taken away for cleaning, and what have been left in their place are replica exhibits. And you feel that even though perhaps you weren't literate enough in history to identify the difference between the two, you feel like somehow you've been denied authenticity. And when we think about fetishes, for example, if we think about like a magical statue that you used in order to invoke some kind of magical power, it would need that kind of quality of authenticity to it, wouldn't it? It would need that drop of blood, or it would need to be fashioned from that precise material or something along those lines. So I do think it's important. I do think that, say, something that had been made in a factory, mass produced in a factory, it just wouldn't have that Lorehold magic that we could exploit. Okay, here's a great question, really interesting, and this one I think that you'll be able to handle, Dr. Hart. It's from Comrade Cam. Is there a chance that the myths, legends, and tales will lose their origin point because of constant reinterpretation in current media? Say 100 years from now.
I would say they've already lost their origin point. So within folklore studies, the consensus at the moment, because it's always changing, right? But the consensus nowadays is that we can't even really speak of an origin for a folktale. Particularly anything within folklore comes from all sorts of places. It's been around all sorts of places, and it's not, especially if it's a lot of it has come from oral tradition and there isn't a written record, then there isn't an identifiable origin point, and that's fine. You know, it's the tradition, the history that we look at, and the way different versions have interacted with each other, affected each other, what's been lost, what's been added, what's been changed. So it's a really good point, because it's important to remember that we can't actually speak of an authoritative source or authoritative original version of a folktale, because there isn't one. There just isn't one.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of that, maybe not in folktale, but in larger literary context, is Homer, the Homeric question. The truth is, probably, I'm no classic scholar, that Homer is largely made up to equip us to make sense of the classical era. It's difficult to believe that there was one single codifying presence that brought together the epic poetry of the Iliad or the Odyssey.
So Homer is more like a metaphor.
Exactly. So he's kind of been created through the ages. We have already lost what the idea of that originary point, and we've simply kind of invented one. A kind of consoling point. That, of course, is where Lorehold comes in, right? Because we are trying to go back. We're trying to excavate. We're trying to find. We're trying to follow those threads through history. But there seldom is that point. Okay, let's ask a slightly more creative question. It comes from the delightfully named Dr. Chunk. If you both got expelled from Lorehold, it's not impossible, which college would you pledge to instead?
Ooh.
Great question.
I'm very drawn to Witherbloom. I mean, it's that I do a lot of work with the Gothic, and so the the terrifying trees come to life and the mad scientists. That's very much up my alley. So I think Witherbloom would be great fun. I mean, I know that's counter to my orderly persona today, which is certainly something I value greatly. But yeah, I think a bit of the craziness of Witherbloom.
Well, what you'd expect me to say as a scholar of literature is, I'm obviously
You're definitely Silverquill.
Right up for Silverquill,
Yeah, you are,
I'd be right in there about Silverquill. But the truth is, I'm a frustrated artist. I'd much rather be in Prismari.
Emphasis on frustrated, I think.
I dream of being able really to truly express myself.
Nobody else dreams of that.
to create art I think in any medium, in sculpture, like in Ghost, or painting like Jackson Pollock.
Ghost isn't sculpture; it's pottery.
Okay, so obviously I'm only a very much apprentice level scholar in Prismari, but I'm willing to learn. So any of you out there, senior people in Prismari, just send me a message, and when I will inevitably be expelled from Lorehold, I'll sign up. Yeah, you're right. I need to watch the lectures from Prismari. Absolutely right. So there you go, Dr. Chunk. You have your answer. Okay, very interesting question here from Conrad Lee John. What about racist folklore?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are lots of racist things about pygmies in various countries. For example, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia. There are certainly kind of racist tropes all through folklore in the European tradition as well.
Yes.
So how do you deal with them?
Yeah, really good question. And it is acknowledged now in folklore studies that the academic discipline itself has had systemic racism through significant periods of its history. So, folklore studies being done by white people from a perspective of white superiority, particularly kind of thinking of Britain in, the 19th and early 20th century. They're coming from the context of the British Empire and going out and studying other peoples, and they have this particular perspective, and that is difficult. The dilemma is, what do you do about that now? Do you bury it? Do you say, this is some bad stuff and we don't, it is not worth the airtime? Or do you address it? Do you bring it to light and try and have a conversation about it, try and acknowledge where things have gone wrong and been unacceptable and what we need to do better? There isn't an answer to that. And it might depend on the particular thing that you're looking at. Maybe some things are better kind of consigned to history. But I incline more to the latter position, that it's better to just kind of face things. Actually, there is in fact a card in the Strixhaven set. It's what's it called? It's a memory one.
You cannot put me on the spot like that, I'm afraid. We'll have to come back to it.
There is a card in which the flavour text kind of says we have to look at the awful parts of history, and so I would throw my cards in with that position.
Well, it's interesting that you framed it as a question of burying versus excavating.
Yeah.
Quite Loreholdish.
Yeah.
It's also a kind of dialectic, right?
It is.
The truth is that constantly exposing yourself to the horrors of the past is not necessarily a way of learning. It's not necessarily a way of addressing them.
Mm.
So actually, we do kind of need to find the sweet spot between those two positions.
Definitely.
Now, this is a question not just for Lorehold, but also for Strixhaven. It's a question for the university in general.
Mm.
Some of you might have heard the term decolonization or decolonizing of curricula. And that's a big ongoing conversation that's happening in universities around the world, but particularly in places like Britain with an imperial past. And I think that very interesting question about how we deal with racist folklore would come under that auspice. It would come under really addressing those critical questions, those difficult questions about how folklore has advanced what I would call raceologies. So the logics, the creation of races in the past. Yeah, that's a great question and very interesting. Okay, let me just get a handle on where we are. Okay, next question from Comrade Cam, although I think Comrade Cam is actually relaying questions from elsewhere. Can the content created on platforms that are no longer in existence, like MySpace, for example, be considered a kind of internet folklore?
Yeah, I think they are. Yeah, there are people who study that at universities. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, not me, so I don't know how much I can say about it. But yes, it is. I mean, why not, right? So folklore is about, stories, ideas, motifs, symbols that have circulated among the folk. And the internet is now where that happens. And it seems like, I think, a good idea to study what is happening on the internet, yeah? And especially as the internet develops its own history. So we've come far enough into the internet, the world with the internet, for things to have changed hugely. Every decade, things are changed and things are lost. So I think it's important. I mean, it's a cliche about history that you're trying to learn for the future and not make the same mistakes again. But I think it applies to the history of the internet and studying the folklore of the internet. What has been lost and buried, and what has been carried forward and changed? Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the problematic of the internet isn't the significance of things, because actually one presumes that there is a vast amount of significant, as it were, cultural exchange on MySpace, as an example, right? It's more the difficulty of scope. So there's just simply such a vast amount of culture, because culture is what it is, out there in the history of the internet. I mean, I don't have a I don't really know, but you could venture some kind of analogies of the volume of cultural production before and after the internet. It wouldn't surprise me to find that we've produced more culture since the internet started than we did before it started. Yeah. So it really is, I suppose, a problem of scope as much as it is of significance.
And how do you choose what to study, and how do you find it all? Yeah, definitely.
Okay, here's another question about folklore. You're getting all the questions about folklore. How can you make sure that your folklore is authentic? I think this comes back a little bit to the question you were asking. You were talking about origin points earlier on. The example given by Conrad Lejeune is the Brothers Grimm. It changed a lot.
Yes,
it changed a lot.
Yes, it did. And the Brothers Grimm themselves did a lot of changing. God, I could talk for ages about the Brothers Grimm. I'm going to stop myself from doing so. But yeah, so the Brothers Grimm, their children's and household tales, which was the volume of folk and fairy tales that we know best, went through 7 editions over about 50 years, and they changed the tales each time, and that was because the context in which the tales were being republished changed. So initially they were published as scholarly texts, and it was only much later that people became interested in them as like entertainment or education for children, and they were rewriting them to suit that new audience. And there was maybe also a bit of a commercial aspect when they realized, oh god, we might actually make some money from this. So yeah, there is that question of authenticity. Is a folktale no longer authentic when somebody like the Brothers Grimm has rewritten it? I would say that's what folklore is. It is a tradition of tales being retold and changed. So there isn't an authentic version, but there can be inauthenticity. So there can be things that are, and actually there are some terms for this, like fake lore or faux lore, right? Where, but that applies more to whole tales that are made up and presented as folklore, but actually they don't have any history. So that's how I think we can consider inauthenticity.
That's great. That's your resident folklore specialist. So we are running, I think, a little bit low on time. There are a couple more questions in the bank that I do want to turn our attention to, but I'm going to try and be quite quick. I'm going to handle them myself. If that's okay. I'm going to field them. You've been doing a lot of talking. I feel like I deserve a bit more air.
Go on then.
So the first question is from Electro Tal. If you burn down and rebuild a thing, isn't that just the ship of Theseus? How much of a thing is invested in the thingness of it? That's a really complex theoretical question that I'd be hard-pressed to answer. Thing theory being actually an extensive kind of intellectual enterprise. I mean, I can explain the ship of Theseus. This comes back to the question of rebuilding the Library of Alexandria. the Ship of Theseus is kind of philosophical puzzle, which says, if you take away individual components of something and replace them with other things, to the extent that you have replaced every single component of it, is it still the same thing?
This is just Trigger's broom, isn't it?
Well, I think it was the Ship of Theseus first. So the ship, you take a plank away, you take a mast away, you take a sail away, you take an anchor away, you put a new one in. At what point does it stop being the original ship? Trigger's broom, which is from Only Fools and Horses, is just a broom head and a broom handle. So it's quite a lot simpler and easier to grasp. I suppose what does make what is the essence of the thing? It's a complex philosophical question that I am not in a strong position to answer. But one thing I can say is that we do recognize that things do have essences, or that history has some kind of important role to play here. That if we rebuilt the Library of Alexandria brick by brick and somehow reconstituted all of the texts that would have been there, it would not have the same kind of soul, which I'm going to put out there, as the Library of Alexandria once had. And that's, again, I think a reason why people didn't want to rebuild piece by piece the Mackintosh Library in Glasgow. And it's one of the reasons why the Globe Theatre, which has been rebuilt on the basis of a kind of bit-by-bit meticulous reconstruction of the Renaissance theatre, needs to redefine itself for the present. It can't be seen as a kind of perfect recapturing of the past.
But I do think if something is entirely rebuilt in the present, that's different to being gradually rebuilt bit by bit, because then it does actually have history and continuity.
The last question was, is a sarcophagus a statue? I'd say no. Do you know why? Because a sarcophagus has someone inside it.
Yes.
So the essence is really within. But I mean, I'd love to say more on that question. I think it's a really interesting one. It comes back to the pharaohs, which I was talking about earlier on. But we're already quite along over time. We don't want to impede too much on the next talk,
yeah, of course.
right? So let's just say thanks very much again for coming along and listening to our talk. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for those excellent questions.
Yeah. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Hey everyone, planeswalkers, mage students, and lore lovers throughout the multiverse. Welcome to the second discussion in our Lorehold day for Strixhaven week, the week of lectures. My name's Eric. I'm going to be the guest professor for our second lecture this evening. And while our first lecture, they did a really great job of going into folk tales and fairy tales and folklore about the greater world in general and relating that towards Magic the Gathering. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the lore of Magic the Gathering specifically and center it around Strixhaven because that's the newest set. That's what we're all here to learn about. So, just a brief outline of this lecture that I'll be giving today. Start with a little introduction about myself, just kind of who I am, why I'm giving this lecture, why I love Lorehold. And then we'll talk about what lore is specifically and its relationship with Magic the Gathering. Then we'll talk about lore in Magic particularly, looking at a few examples of lore throughout Magic and how we can get our hands on the lore of Magic. Then we'll take a deeper dive into the lore of Strixhaven specifically, looking at Arcavios and the University of Strixhaven as well as the colleges. And then specifically the College of Lorehold, because today is Lorehold Day. So we're going to spend a little more time on Lorehold than a couple of the other colleges, but we'll get to all of them for sure. And then finally, we'll wrap up with about 15 minutes of question and answer. So any questions you have for me, just put them in the chat and hopefully I'll get around to them with the last 15 minutes of today's presentation. So let's get right into it. A little bit about me. So I am not an expert, as you might say, in like folklore or fairy tale or anything like that. What I am is just a fantasy enthusiast. I grew up reading a lot of fantasy books, playing a lot of fantasy games, specifically Magic the Gathering. I've been playing that for almost 20 years now. I think I got first introduced in the Kamigawa set, which was super interesting to me. The lore behind that, all the legendary creatures and all the samurai and ninja and everything like that, it was super cool. More recently, however, I've gotten more into the lore of Magic the Gathering, kind of doing some research of my own, taking a deeper dive into the lore of Magic. Around 2018, when Dominaria's set came out, I was super interested in that plan because it has a big history throughout Magic the Gathering. And even more recently, this last year, I decided to share my passion for lore and storytelling by creating a YouTube channel. And I am with the Lorebrarians YouTube channel. So if you're interested at all in lore of Magic the Gathering and maybe lore of other fantasy genres down the road, go ahead and check me out after this lecture. I recently put up a video about Strixhaven, but I'll be sure to hit all the big talking points today. Okay, so welcome to Lorehold. So Lorehold is the red and white aligned college, and this is the College of Archaeomancy. So Archaeomancy can be likened to the historians of our own world and the archaeologists of our own world. So they're really interested in digging up the past. They're interested in excavating the ruins of ages long ago and seeing what they can discover, what they can bring to light, and bring that information back to the current day to see how it can shape potentially the future. And so I've pulled up a few cards here that really look at that aspect of Lorehold, really capture it with art and flavor text. You can see their excavation sites on Lorehold Excavation, and then they plumb the ruins of ages long past with thrilling discovery. And Archaeomancer's map shows us what a civilization of the olden days could have been on Arcavios. So before we get into Lorehold and the colleges of Strixhaven, we need to take a moment and talk about what lore is exactly. So I've pulled up just the definition of lore. So you can think of it as knowledge, right? Or traditions of a particular subject, of a particular topic, or held by a group of individuals. And it's usually passed through oral tradition. Now, in the realm of magic, a lot of the lore is also passed through written text. And if we look at the card to the right, Living Lore, I mean, that is what it is. It's just a bunch of scrolls and text animated, given life. So it's lore that has become alive. And so when we think about lore in its relationship to magic, and a lot of fantasy stories, fantasy settings in general, I like to think of lore as the story within the story. So you pick up a book or pick up an article or something that you're interested in, and you read about the characters and the topics. But just below that, there's this whole wide world of different interactions, different creatures, different plants, different landscapes that really flesh out the story. And that is what I would consider lore. It's all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes besides the main topic. So I like to think of lore in three fundamental pillars. First, lore is history, and we can liken this to our own history, right? So lore is stories and tales, stories of different people, of different cultures, and it's passed from generation to generation. And so these stories eventually become something mystical, something magical to the people hundreds or dozens of generations into the future, and they look to their heroes of the past. And we can see that in Tome of Legends, a card from Eldraine's set, where it's this big volume of stories of heroes of legends, and this is the lore of that plane. So lore also tells us why things are the way they are. In the current day, we have certain interactions, certain civilizations and technology, and just the way people go about their daily business. Well, that's all come from something before it. And so lore is the history that sets the foundation for why these things are the way they are. And finally, it connects past events to the current day, and it connects past events to one another. You find a little interesting blurb or fact about lore, and you kind of piece it together. You follow a trail of breadcrumbs, and you see how that fact interacts with other facts and other characters and other story arcs potentially. And now we have a web of interwoven stories and tales, and this creates the history or the lore of magic or any other fantasy genre. Second, I like to think of lore as an escape. So why do we pick up these fantasy books, these fantasy games? It's a break from our reality, right? It's a break from the mundane. It gives us a chance to explore and to investigate our own creativity as well as the creativity of others. And exploration is a huge topic that I like to talk about on my YouTube channel, where we just dive deep into the small little details, things that are often overlooked, and that fills us with this wanderlust, right? We want to go and be in these places. We want to experience these things. And so we try to gather as much knowledge and information about that lore so that we can experience it secondhand. And if we look at this card to the right, Into the Story, another card from the Eldraine set, which was really big on folktale and folklore, you can see this is kind of what we do when we pick up a book or play a game of Magic, right? We go into that world. We go into that universe and into its story, and we become part of that story. And it just adds another layer of mysticism and discovery. It gives us something to look forward to, something to dive deeper into, which is really awesome. And finally, the third pillar is that lore enkindles. So it adds a dimensionality. It adds kind of 3 dimensions to our story, right? So we have our base story, and that's completely fleshed out with characters and story arcs and events. But beyond that, we have this living, breathing world. And lore is tied a lot to the world building process, which I believe was covered yesterday with Silverquill. So you can check that out after you listen to my lecture. But it just adds this dimensionality to a particular plane, a particular set, or a particular story. And it really sparks passion specifically within me, but I'm sure many other people. It's this passion, this drive, this desire to know more, to know what these cards mean, what these characters do with their lives, what stories they have, what adventures they go on. And it really gives me passion. and it evokes a sense of wonder and fuels not just our own creativity, but the creativity of others who go on to make this fantastical world that we all enjoy. So, that's a little breakdown of lore. Now, how do we look at lore in relation to magic specifically? How do we uncover magic's secrets of lore? There are multiple different ways to look at the lore through Magic the Gathering. One of them, and my personal favorite, is just to look at the art of the card, look at the title, look at the flavor text, read that small little blip of information at the bottom of some cards that gives you, it's like a little window, a glimpse into the story that is unfolding on that plane. And it just, oh, I love it. I love reading flavor text and making connections that, might fly under the radar if you're not paying close attention to those. So that's our first step. So also the MTG Story and MTG Novels. So Wizards, on their website, they have these weekly articles and stories tied to the release of new sets that give us a little breakdown of the lore behind each set and each plane and each world. Before that, they had fully fleshed paperback, hardback novels that would really take a deeper dive into the plane, into the set at hand to give the readers even more to grab onto. And finally, if you're really interested in lore and Magic's lore in particular, MTG Wiki is a great resource. It's a great site because it compiles all of the information from anywhere and brings it all into one easily accessible place, but is a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? So you have all these tabs and hyperlinks and everything available to you, and you end up going down the rabbit hole a little. At least I do when I do my research into topics, and I end up with 40 tabs before my internet starts crashing because there's just so much to know. But that is another great resource for uncovering Magic's secrets. So I wanted to pull up just an example that we can kind of dissect here as we go about our lecture. So I pulled up a card from Dominaria's set, released I believe in 2018. This is Yogmoth's Vile Offering. And so we can break down the lore behind this card in a couple of different ways. So first, if we look just at the text, just at the title of the card, we know it's talking about this character called Yogmoth. But we don't know exactly who he is just from the card or what it is. We know that it's offering something, but it's not an offer that we really want to accept. And if we go down here to the flavor text, it says, "Centuries ago, a mad god offered a simple trade." And just from that sentence alone and the title, we've kind of pieced together that this event happened hundreds of years from the current day on Dominaria. We also know that it involved Yogmoth, who might be a mad god, and he could be very well pictured at the heart of the card, that very scary looking monstrosity. And he's got an offer. It looks like an individual he could be offering, and it's a simple trade, but one that could have dangerous repercussions. And so that's the kind of thing that just captures my desire to know, my passion, my own creativity, and really drives me to seek out these stories behind Magic's cards. Okay, so now that we've talked about lore a little bit and its relationship to magic, I want to spend some time talking about the lore of Arcavios specifically, which is the plane where Strixhaven's set takes place. And they were gracious enough to give us an actual map of the plane of Arcavios. And it's split up between two different continents. So the northern continent of Erythia has a bunch of different ruins, a bunch of different peoples and cultures and civilization. It's where the majority of the set takes place. And in the upper right-hand corner of the continent, you can see Strixhaven University. That's where all of the mages gather from across Arcavios to learn and to hone their skills. Now in the south, we have a continent called Galathul. Unfortunately, there isn't too much information about Galathul, but I imagine if we do return to Arcavios in a future Strixhaven set, we could learn a little more about Galathul. So the history of Arcavios. really begins with the Dawning Age. So this was the age where the plane was born. And it wasn't exactly like other planes that float across the blind eternities in Magic's multiverse. It was born from the overlap, from the collision of two distinct and different planes, and how they melded into one, how their mana ley lines kind of wrapped together and created this volatile maelstrom of energy. That is what gives Arcavios and Strixhaven set its uniqueness, its individuality, with these dual colors of mana, these conflicting colors of mana, because it was born from two conflicting planes. Now, in the Dawning Age, we also see the birth of the elder dragons of Arcavios. These will be the founder dragons of Strixhaven, and each is a master of two distinct colors of mana. Now we also have another really old race of individual beings. These are the avatars called the Archaics. And I've pulled up a card called Teaching of the Archaics here. And if we read the flavor text of the cards, it tells us that mages, they seek out these beings because they have such a vast supply of knowledge and they have such a vast history behind them, and they're so well adapted to magic and using it that these mages seek them out, seek out their teachings. And they kind of walk along Arcavios, dispensing riddles, if you will. Now, over to the right, we also have a card called Frostboil Snarl. And so snarls are remnants. They're remnants of those two collisions of planes, that maelstrom of violent mana surging. And these snarls are leftovers. They're remnants of dangerous, conflicting colors of mana coming together in beautiful cooperation. Now, individuals who come close to a snarl can use its energy, use its mana to really fuel powerful spells. And it was in the Dawning Age that the discovery of magic by the elder dragons took place. So, going on, we have the Blood Age. So this is a period of unending war and violence and conquest. It began about 3,000 years, from the current day on Arcavios. And so this is what a lot of the ruins that these Lorehold mages are uncovering. Ruins from the Blood Age. This is where mortal beings and races first discovered and used magic. But they used it dangerously and at an elementary level. And they used it for conquest. And if we look at some of the cards here, we see that in the flavor text of Lightning Helix, so mages in the Blood Age would call down actual thunderstorms on their enemy. So the Blood Age is marked by tumultuous violence and conquest and really carving up the map of Arcavios. So much of the ruins of today's world come from the Blood Age. Now, how did we leave such a violent and backwards age? This is the Mystic Age. So the Mystic Age started about 700 years ago when the Elder Dragons ended the Blood Age. They used their mastery of magic to quell all the violence and all the conquest and really bring those civilizations to kneel. They also founded Strixhaven University at this time. They saw that individuals of the Blood Age used magic for conquest rather than for advancement. And they saw that they weren't really masters of this magic. They knew that they could learn so much more. So the Elder Dragons founded an institute that would allow individuals to safely practice and progress magic. And that would become known as Strixhaven University. And so we see here in the flavor text of Regrowth, we see the Mystic Age named, and we see that centuries of war of the Blood Age had broken Arcavios, but a single seed began the process of renewal. That single seed could very well be the founding of Strixhaven. So, the northern continent of Orithia on Arcavios is also called the Vastlands because it's so extremely large. And if we pull up a couple of cards that talk about the Vastlands, we see on the right, environmental sciences. We see a first-year mage student or a first-year student learning about the environments of Arcavios and the Vastlands. And if we read the flavor text, it says, first years quickly learn how the Vastlands earned its name. And you can see at least 5 different ecosystems hovering around this individual, 5 different places of different colors of mana. So it gives you an appreciation just how large the vastlands are. And we can see on the left with Explore the Vastlands, we see a mage consulting one of those archaics to see if they can tell them about untold knowledge. And so we also have a couple of cards that talk about star arches. So star arches are other structures that can be found dotting the landscape of Arcavios and the Vastlands that were born in the Dawning Age since the beginning of the plane. And they all lie dormant right now, or so many people seem to think. They're all shaped relatively similar, but their sizes vary drastically from super small to massive, massive, massive star arches. Now, some people believe that they're locations of particularly powerful significance, or that mark maybe the birth or death of a powerful mage. And if we look at the flavor text of a card called Spring-Made Servant, we see that these star arches are still suffused with mana, and they're mana rich, and lots of flora and fauna flock to these star arches to feed off of that mana. So we've exited the Vastlands, and now we're coming up to Strixhaven University, the pinnacle of learning and knowledge on the entire plane of Arcavios. And so what do we see when we first come upon Strixhaven University? So we first see the Torches of Enlightenment. Now these are 5 different lines of massive, eternally lit flames that lead from the countryside of the Vastlands, about 100 miles out from the walls of Strixhaven proper, and they lead towards the university. And this symbolizes our progress from ignorance and naivety towards enlightenment, and so we follow these torches to Strixhaven. Like I mentioned, this is the pinnacle, the premier spot of arcane knowledge and enlightenment on the entire plane of Arcavios, and potentially the entire multiverse. And each year, hundreds of aspiring students apply to Strixhaven University from different cities and towns and villages in hopes that they might learn magecraft and bring it back home with them so that they can advance their own village. And so, what do we see here? We see a couple of cards that give us a clue into Strixhaven University. On the left, we have Letter of Acceptance. So this card symbolizes that letter. It shows us that letter that all those mage students look for in the mail to see that they've been accepted, that they can finally learn about magic and magecraft in Strixhaven. And then Archway Commons just gives us a good illustration, a picture of Strixhaven University. You can see the colonnade, you can see the gardens and the lawn and many spires in the background. So it gives you an appreciation for how large this university actually is. And so if we continue on, we come across individuals walking, going to class, coming from class. There's a hubbub, a bustle, right? So the first year that new students come to Strixhaven, they're called first years. They don't actually join a college proper until they've completed 1 full year of didactic knowledge and learning. And then it's up to them to decide through advisors and through their own kind of instincts and what colors of mana they appreciate and lean towards, what college they want to go to. And so that is what it's all about, joining the college after that first year and then really diving deep into specialties from then on. Now, after individuals graduate from Strixhaven, they can pursue a variety of different things, right? They can go back to their villages and they can teach others about what they have learned. They can use their magic and their magical ability to help build up their own community. They can also stay on as professors and researchers at Strixhaven University so that they can cultivate the future generations. And so, if we pull up a few cards that illustrate what Strixhaven University is all about, on the left we can see that eager first year, right? So they're coming, they're ready to learn and test their mettle and practice. And so that's what first years really do in that first 2 semesters of learning. Now at the top we see a card called Academic Dispute. So, all of these students and colleges who compete in friendly competition usually end up dueling each other, right? They want to test their mettle against their rivals, against their friends. And we can see that in the card Academic Dispute. And then finally on the right is Archmage Emeritus. So this is what happens to some professors that go out and explore the vast lands, explore the history and the lore behind Arcavios, and then bring it back to share with others. So now I want to take a moment and talk about the Biblioplex. The Biblioplex itself is the heart of Strixhaven, both physically sitting at the center of the university, as well as symbolically, right? It's the heart of Strixhaven. It's what keeps knowledge and intellect and magecraft alive. It's the largest library in the entire multiverse, and this university is huge. It has its own weather patterns within. It has huge rivers and moats that require ferry crossing by boat just to get from one end of the Biblioplex to the other. So why is it so big? Well, it's been said that it contains every single spell ever known to the entire multiverse, and it contains vast treasure troves of tomes and knowledge and texts that individual students and professors can use to advance themselves in their knowledge. Now, the Biblioplex also sits above an extremely powerful snarl called the Strixhaven Snarl, and this snarl could give power to the entire university. So it's really a symbolic meaning to have the Biblioplex at the heart of Strixhaven. Now, if we look at a few cards that highlight the Biblioplex in their art, we can see it front and center. It's massive. So I know this picture doesn't give a good scale for it, but those Torches of Enlightenment are huge, and we can barely see them. They're small still to how vast the Biblioplex is, and you can see even clouds forming around it. So this library is huge. It could take days, weeks, months, years for sure, just to find what you're looking for. Now, fortunately, it is constantly manned by artificial constructs and cog workers that we can see in Curate, and so they make sure that all the tomes and texts are in their proper order. So one other thing about the Biblioplex is there's a particular wing called the Mystical Archive, and this is where every known spell in the multiverse is located. And that is highlighted in the Mystical Archive printing that coincided with the release of the Strixhaven set. And so if we pull up a few of the cards, we can see these are extremely powerful spells that have been given a rework, spells throughout the history of the game of Magic the Gathering, but also throughout the history of the multiverse in general within the story. And so I really appreciate these cards for two reasons. First, it gives us a reprint of cards with some new cool art and potentially new flavor text to explore, but it also gives us an inkling into maybe mages and professors at Strixhaven know of the greater multiverse, know that they're not the only plane in existence, and perhaps many planeswalkers come to Arcavios to explore the Biblioplex and impart their own knowledge on Strixhaven. So, in big contrast to the quiet, page-turning hallways and tomes and all the hallways of the Biblioplex, is this really raucous and rambunctious sport called Mage Tower. So what exactly is Mage Tower? If we step across the lawn of the Biblioplex, we'll come across this huge coliseum where Mage Tower takes place. Now, this is the premier sport of Strixhaven University, right? Every college or university today has their own sport, and they have these rivalries with other universities and other colleges. And Strixhaven is no different. Mage Tower gives these mage students an opportunity to practice their skills in a little bit of friendly competition. So to break it down, there are two teams. Each team is made of 5 different mages from a particular college, and each mage summons a mascot creature, and now they put those mascots on their tower, and these towers sit opposite of another on the lawn. And the purpose of the game is to steal an opposing team's mascot and bring it to your own tower to score points. And at the end of time, whoever has the most points wins. Now, something about Mage Tower that most other sports might not have is that magic is not off limits. Sure, harmful and dangerous magic is nullified or canceled, but every other type of magical feat is allowed. And so, we can pull up a few cards that highlight Mage Tower specifically. Here on the left is Strixhaven Stadium. Now this is the stadium where Mage Tower takes place, and thousands of students and fans and professors gather close, hitting elbows with one another as they cheer on their team. And over to the right, mascot interception. So this gives us a clue into the tactics behind Mage Tower and what it truly means to capture an enemy team's mascot. Strixhaven University and the campus, it's time to take a little deeper dive into the colleges of Strixhaven. And we'll begin with the College of Silverquill. So each college at Strixhaven is a combination of two opposing colors of mana that predate, Strixhaven University. We've talked about the overlap of the two different planes and how they created particularly unique magic of Arcavios. This is given form in the colleges of Strixhaven. So Silverquill, each college also has a particular motto or line. Their motto is sharp style, sharper wit. So Silverquill is the College of Eloquence. It's the college of not only written word, but also spoken word. And Silverquill was founded by the elder dragon Shadrix Silverquill, which we can see to the left. And the particular combination of these two gives us a few different unique opportunities in lore to explore. So they are the best and the brightest. Second just doesn't cut it to Silverquills. They have to be the best. They're also particularly charismatic and very good at leading and leadership. The white side of Silverquill gives us language to inspire, language to help their comrades, to help bolster morale and spirits. Well, the black aspect of Silverquill is language to scathe, right? Those cunning retorts, those scathing remarks to really cut the ankles from underneath their opponents and really, really deflate them. And so we see that on display in a couple of different cards. Right here, I've pulled up Silverquill Apprentice and Silverquill Command, and you can see they're really sharply dressed. They love their inkling creatures. These are the mascot of Silverquill, and inkling is just that written or verbal text kind of given form and given shape. And they really appreciate the written language. Next up, we have the College of Prismari, and their motto is express yourself with the elements. So Prismari is the blue and red aligned College of Elemental Arts, and it was founded by Elder Dragon Galazeth Prismari, seen on the left here. So Prismari is all about a show. It's all about creating art and showcasing that art to anybody who can appreciate it and anybody who will enjoy it. And they really live and thrive for a spectacle as well, right? They want to create something, but they also want to do it in a way that is over the top and really flamboyant and awesome and really inspires the crowd. So the blue side of Prismari is more about practice and perfection, right? They're going to spend hours and days really honing their craft, perfecting their skill before they put it on display. Whereas the red side is a lot more emotional. They're driven by bursts of inspiration, bursts of creativity to really create these over-the-top shows of art. And if we pull up a couple of those cards with Prismari Apprentice and Prismari Command, we can see them really combining different elements, not just fire and ice, but also earth, air, water, anything. It's like a palette to them, right? A template that they use to create their art. It's truly spectacular. So next up we have Quandrix, the College of Numeromancy, and their slogan is, or their motto is, math is magic. So if there were a particular college that I would just probably flunk out of, it would be Quandrix, because I am not much of a math magician. Like I mentioned, this is the College of Numeromancy, College of Numbers, and really altering those numbers and calculating those things to create truly spectacular spells. This was founded by Tanazir Quandrix, the green and blue aligned Elder Dragon. And so they're really focused on seeing the patterns, seeing the design in nature, of nature, and either building upon that design or using that design to create their own imitations of the natural world. So the blue aspect is all about theory and proofs, right? They're really going to crunch the numbers. They're really going to take their time and extract all these theorems from nature and from reality. The green side, those green mages, are trying to bring possibility that blue finds in theory and bring it to life, really give it shape, really give it form, and apply the natural world to their magic. And we can see this unfold before us in the art and flavor text of a couple of Quandrix cards. We have the Quandrix Apprentice, and he's really crunching the numbers here in the art, right? He's trying to unlock the secrets of their world and manipulate them to his own advantage. Next up, we have the College of Witherbloom. So their motto is, get your hands dirty. So this college is the College of Essence Studies, and it was founded by Elder Dragon Beledros Witherbloom. And this Elder Dragon is black and green aligned. So they are masters of the life cycle, right? Essence, life, death, the entire cycle they are masters of. Green is really the aspect of life, whereas black is the aspect of death, and they combine to form this cycle. Now, green encourages life and really fosters growth and development, where the black side exploits death as well as uses life to maybe bring the dead from beyond back. And so we can see that on a couple of cards as well. We have our Witherbloom Apprentice, and he's creating some sort of potion or brew, and he's using what looks like the heart or the essence of another being to fuel that powerful spell. And I've saved the best for last, right? It is Lorehold Day, so we're going to be talking about Lorehold, which is probably my favorite college for sure, but many others, and we're going to spend some time really diving deep into Lorehold. So Lorehold is, their motto is leave no stone unturned. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, they're the College of Archaeomancy. They're going to be digging up ruins and relics of the past and bringing them to life and giving them life so that we can learn from them and take that knowledge to the future. So their Elder Dragon founder is Velomachus Lorehold, the red and white aligned Elder Dragon. And they are all about uncovering the past and bringing that past to life, bringing history to life. And this is really connected to lore in general, hence the name Lorehold. So it's all about the lore of Arcavios, the history of Arcavios, and uncovering that history to share with others. So we can see that unfold in cards like Lorehold Apprentice and Lorehold Command. They are masters of scrolls and ancient texts, but not only reading them and powering them, but bringing them to life. You can see in the art of Lorehold Apprentice that she has brought the pages to life. She's given spirits life so that she can learn from them. So I want to talk briefly about the Deans of Lorehold. We're going to start with the red-aligned Dean of Chaos, Plarg. In Orc Shaman, I mean, you gotta love that name, right? Plarg, it's just great. So he is the Dean of Chaos, of red mana, of emotion and inconsistency. He's really focused on the military history of Arcavios, really focused on the Blood Age, and he believes that history is unpredictable and war-torn, and the best way to really grasp that history is to accept it as truth, right? To learn war and military tactics from those who came before. He believes that you can't have great discovery without great risk, right? You're not going to find him or the Red Alliance students sitting in a library looking at dusty old tomes. No, you're going to find them blowing up rocks and really digging deep into these trenches and ruins and excavations to uncover treasures of the ancient past. And he sees the white-aligned dean, Augusta. He sees her efforts as wasted time. So I just want to talk briefly about the Red Dichotomy. So red is all about passion and inspiration and spur of the moment decisions and things like that. It's about reckless discovery and adventure. It's about adventure, about actually exploring and living through this history. So they rely on emotion while uncovering the past. And they are such mages as warlords who really look at the Blood Age for war, ruin shamans and cliffbusters who create these massive magical explosions to uncover buried sites. And we can see those on display in cards like Illuminate History and Heated Debate, where they're really focused on action, on the now, on what can I learn at this moment and what can I uncover. Now, we're going to talk about the white-aligned aspect of Lorehold, and we'll talk about Augusta, the Dean of Order. So she and White are focused on order, focused on community, and that's her drive, trying to uncover the history of Arcavios and bring it to the current day so they can better their community. She's focused on chronicling the past, not just uncovering it and then blowing it up. No, she wants to, for posterity's sake, have everything written down. She is a master of spirit studies and a past raiser, so she brings spirits to life and has conversations with them and learns from their time. She believes that history repeats itself predictably, which is at odds with Plark. He believes it's unpredictable. So she thinks by looking at history, looking at the past, you can predict the future. And so learning the mistakes of the past can help prevent them in the future and inform future decisions. The dichotomy of White. So they're about meticulous recording of the past. These individuals you'll find at those desks within the library, looking at scrolls, writing it down, making sure nothing gets overlooked. Because the past is such a wealth of information and knowledge, they rely more on patience and order, organizing things more than read. They divine wisdom from the ruins of the past, as well as from the statues and spirits of the past. These come in the shape of mages such as truth finders, relic readers, and past raisers. And you can see here on a couple of cards on display, reduced to memory. So this individual has taken the spirit out of what appears to be either a giant or a giant statue. I'm not quite sure. And then Professor of Symbology, really focusing on the written word and what's been recorded of the past to learn from the future. So Lorehold in this red and white aligned college is all about the spirit of adventure and uncovering lore and the history of the past. And their mascot and the creature that they're most engaged with is the spirit. Spirits of the Blood Age, such as Blood Age General, or spirits from other ages or other times in Arcavios' history. And they rely on these spirits to inform their future. So that has been a cursory kind of general dive into lore and the lore behind Strixhaven. I want to end here with just a topic about where to begin. So if you're interested in the lore of Magic the Gathering specifically, and the lore of Lorehold has really captured your interest, piqued your interest, where might you begin? So there are many, many different ways to begin with uncovering the lore of Magic the Gathering. None of them are particularly right or wrong, but I will give some advice on how I've kind of gotten into the lore of Magic. So really, you need to start small. Whether that means picking your favorite character from a set and figuring out all you can about them, or picking your favorite set out of all the different ones that have come, or your favorite plane. Trying to create parameters to bring it small, keep it small, and explore as much as you can within there. then slowly build from there, right? Now we're going to click on some of those tabs in the MTG Wiki and go a little bit down the rabbit hole so we can slowly build up our knowledge and build up this lore and this hidden story behind the Magic the Gathering sets. Now, one thing to mention is you don't have to go in chronological order. You don't have to start at the very beginning of time in Magic the Gathering, or you don't have to start at Strixhaven, the most recent set. You can pick any time you want and just go from there. Use those resources I mentioned. If you want to, after this video, go check me out on YouTube. I have a lot of lore videos as well, but all those other resources I talked about. And finally, I want you to have fun with it, right? Lore is such an amazing aspect of world building and writing and creativity and games in general. And being able to explore that lore and being able to uncover those truths is really fun. So make sure you have some fun with it. So thank you so much for listening to my talk on Lorehold and the lore of Magic the Gathering and Strixhaven in particular. So I'm going to take a moment. I think we have time. I'm going to take a moment and look at some of the questions that you may have posted in the chat and see if I can answer those questions. I am also going to take a little sip here. All right. So let's see. We have a question here. We're going to go with this first one here. So it's more a comment, I guess, than a question. I bet you could read the flavor text from a card in your hand during an ETH game and would know just based on that. Yes, I used to be very good at knowing the flavor text of many different cards. So it was kind of a game I'd play with some of my friends around the table for sure. Okay, so we have you read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell? I love the footnotes chock full of world building lore. No, I actually haven't read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, though it could be something that I should definitely look into if you really appreciated that and there's a ton of world building and lore in there. I would love exploring that. So, is Mage Tower just a sport to knock yourself out? So people of Arcavios don't repeat the Blood Ages. Yeah, I guess it could be kind of a means to get some of that frustration and anger, and maybe testing out some of these more powerful spells in a contained, enclosed environment, right? So you can practice safely, so you're not kind of hurting anybody. I don't think Mage Tower. I wouldn't think that Mage Tower came about because they didn't want to repeat the Blood Age, but more from the aspect of, okay, we've got these 5 colleges. How are we going to compete, right? We have to compete at everything because this college is better than that college and that kind of thing. So that's probably where that may have come up. Okay, so who teaches the didactic classes for first year? Yeah, so I feel like some of those either starting professors, right, not the deans of a particular college, but maybe some of those first kind of couple year professors that are not tenured yet, they're teaching those basics, those fundamentals to those first years. Because you can also kind of think of those first didactic classes as also weeding out potential individuals who can't make it, right? So probably professors who aren't as esteemed as maybe some of the higher professors. Okay. Do Strixhaven professors know of the multiverse and planeswalkers? So this is something that I actually believe could be the case. I haven't actually... I didn't actually include this card in my presentation, but there is a card from the Mystical Archive printing called Blue Sun Zenith, and that has flavor text that I think one of the Quandrix Mage students says, wait, there's this planet with like 5 suns in the multiverse, and she's talking about Mirrodin. And so that would have me believe that, yes, maybe some of these people do know that the greater multiverse exists, which has some pretty crazy implications, I think, for story moving forward and Arcavios in general. Okay. So how could they get access to all the spells in the multiverse, and what's a Snarl? So a Snarl is just this particularly powerful confluence of two opposing colors of mana. They are remnants from the Dawning Age, right? That overlap between two different planes. And to me, it makes sense that each of those two planes had one color of mana. And so these two colors kind of come together in a beautiful contrast. And so it's powerful, but it's also super dangerous. And these snarls can be found dotting the landscape of the vast lands. Now, to answer that first question, how could they get access to all the spells in the multiverse? I personally think that this could be more mages or planeswalkers from the multiverse have heard that Arcavios and Strixhaven is such a wealth of information, and so they come seeking knowledge, but they may also impart their knowledge and their spells and leave it for, for their legacy in the Biblioplex. So they can say, hey, check out, look at this spell. This is the spell that I brought to Arcavios. So that could be an option for sure. Okay. So just a quick question about the Planeswalkers of the set. So yes, Liliana, she is under the guise of Professor Onyx. So she's a professor at Strixhaven. And I don't want to spoil the story too much for those who haven't read, but she had been at Strixhaven before in the past. So it was easy for her to kind of take on that persona. On top of that, we have the twins, Rowan and Will Kenrith. We saw them on Eldraine, as well as in the Battle Bond set on Kylem. So they're there learning. We have Luca, the Coppercoat from Ikoria. He's back. He's here. And he does a couple of cool things in the story. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much. And then we also have Kasmina. She was first mentioned or first seen in War of the Spark as a planeswalker during that Planeswalker War. And she makes another appearance at Strixhaven. So, what do you think of the revamp of the usual Boros characteristics with Lorehold? So, this is a great question, and I actually really appreciate it, right? Because Red has been pretty consistently about artifacts, right? And kind of going through history and learning about all of this stuff. White has been about kind of bringing your graveyard back to the battlefield, digging up the past. I feel like this color combination of Lorehold, where it's focused more on spirits and artifacts and history and the graveyard, where Boros is more that military might, right? They're focused on attacking and armies and combat. I really appreciate how they made all of these different, even though they're color combinations we've seen before, they've given them different life, so they're distinct and separate, and it's really awesome. Okay, from 3B Skeleton Archer 33. So, is Nahiri Lorehold gone mad? Yeah, so I feel as though Nahiri is, so she's quite a bit older than Lorehold, right? So she's a really old ancient planeswalker. So she's been around since before even Strixhaven came around. She recently has gotten that red side to her color. So now she is white and red. So she's kind of dabbling in Lorehold. I think she is a little more towards that aggressive-y Boros type, where she's really focused on maybe damage or equipment or things like that. But I could see a little bit of her maybe dipping into Lorehold if she ever calms down, right? Okay. So we have another question from Grayson787. Who is my favorite walker And if not Soren, okay, so they've already said Soren's the best. So how do you cope with being wrong? Okay, Soren's very cool. My favorite planeswalker, I would have to say, is Ugin, hands down. He is so cool. For those who don't know, he is the brother of one of the multiverse's like biggest baddies in Nicol Bolas. He's colorless. I love him because of that, and because his art is from one of my favorite artists in Magic, which is Raymond Swanland, and I fell in love with that. So he's my favorite. Okay, we have a question about the MTG novels. So this person has not read any of the MTG novels. Which ones would I recommend? So I personally would recommend the Artifact Cycle. This focuses on Urza Planeswalker and his story, and he is one of the biggest characters in the history of Magic the Gathering. He also covers a really wide time frame chronologically, so you'll get a lot of lore and story just from reading his story. So the Artifact Cycle is four books, I believe, but that is a great start, and they're fully fleshed out novels, so they're pretty lengthy but really awesome, and I appreciate those. So yeah. Okay. So Resented Lotus. So earlier you mentioned the heart of the cards in reference to lore. How does this release to the force that impacts other card games? So I'm not entirely sure about the question, but I can kind of talk about maybe potential other card games and the lore behind those. So I am not the biggest I don't have much experience in the realm of too many other card games like maybe Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon or Digimon or things like that. But from my understanding, some of them do have what in essence is like flavor text and maybe a little bit of story. And I know they have shows and anime and stuff like that that goes along with those. So I feel like to get the lore side of those card games, you kind of have to explore those shows, and that's where they can really bring their creative content to life there. So hopefully that kind of answered your question. I was a little confused. So we have a question, another question from Skeleton Archer 33. So what could be the planeswalkers of D&D? Ooh, any guesses? Okay, so that is a really good question, because there is, for those who don't know, there is an upcoming kind of crossover set between D&D and the Forgotten Realms and Magic the Gathering, which is super cool, super interested. I'm really excited how that will pertain to lore as we go forward, but I'm super interested. Anyway, I can't speak about the D&D characters who could be planeswalkers, just because I don't have too much knowledge in the realm of D&D, besides the books of R.A. Salvatore that looked at Driz Do'Urden. So I couldn't really tell you there. I think maybe Garrick could be a cool planeswalker to see, going around the Forgotten Realms, slaying beasts and monsters and having a grand old time hunting those. So I think that could be cool. So question: I'd love to study at Strixhaven. Where do I send my application to? That is a good question. I don't think they have a particular answer. So just like throw it on the wind, and hopefully one of Casmina's fractal owls can take it to Strixhaven and see if they can accept you. Okay, so here's a question from Grim Patron 42. So is Garrick with the twins still? So the twins are Will and Rowan Kenrith. So right now he isn't. They're on Strixhaven right now, kind of learning. He hasn't been seen on Strixhaven yet, but I feel as though he's still tied to them story-wise. He still feels as though he's kind of their protector and wants to keep them safe and kind of wants to be a little bit of their tutor too, because they're young, they're new to planeswalking in the multiverse and things like that. So he'll definitely be keeping an eye on them. All right. So we have a question from Tourniquet02. Which were the two planes that collided and created Arcavios? So that is a really good question, and one that has kind of sparked a good deal of debate and discussion between people who really appreciate the lore for Magic the Gathering. So they don't mention the two planes, but quite a few theories and people think that this collision was actually a kind of integration and creation after consuming two planes from the Eldrazi. So the Eldrazi are these interplanar beings. They live in the blind eternities, and they are massive. They feed on entire planes, and we saw them in Zendikar and also in Shadows over Innistrad, and we've seen those Eldrazi Titans. So people have kind of used the Star Arches and a couple of other cards kind of as inferences into, hey, potentially these Eldrazi consumed two different planes and they created Arcavios. Personally, I don't think that is the case. I know there's always going to be some Eldrazi conspiracy theories, but it's an interesting theory, and I definitely appreciate it. Right now, we don't know which planes kind of died to birth Arcavios, though. Cool. So, who is your favorite MTG artist? Okay, so I had mentioned Raymond Swanland before. I really love his art and his art style, with Ugin particularly, but with a ton of other cards as well. To round out maybe a top three, I would say Chris Ron. I just really appreciate the art on his cards. He does such an amazing job with shading and with like sunsets and twilights and clouds and things like that. Oh, his art is spectacular. And to boot, he also has some pretty cool cards and pretty powerful cards, so it's nice to be able to play those. And I guess my third one is a relatively recent one. This individual is Wiley Beckert. They have this kind of QB sort of form to the arts on some of their cards, and it's almost like a scroll or maybe a cave painting or something like that. It almost feels like, hey, maybe this is how some of these planes would illustrate some of their own stories. So I really appreciate their art as well. So those would have to be my top three artists. So from Tron17, is there anything the archaic represented in Wandering Archaic could be referring to in its flavor text other than the 9 Titans led by Urza? Okay, so this is a card about Wandering Archaic, and the flavor text, I can't remember exactly, but it refers to flying the path of like the 9 herons or birds or something to that end. And wow, that's really cool. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about maybe the 9 Titans before, but it could make sense. I feel like those Titans, just kind of how their story developed and dissolved a little bit, it's maybe not a path I'd want to focus on or fly or set down on, but their initial plan was very just and filled with glory, right? They're going to take on Phyrexia and save Dominaria. So I could see that. And the Archaics have been around for thousands of years. So for sure, maybe they could have met Urza during his many planeswalks throughout history. So that's a really good question. And I hadn't really considered that too much. Cool. So a question about the spells of the mystical archive. This question by Tourniquet 2. So how do the spells of the mystical archive, how are they being added in if they're new? So I would imagine maybe a traveling planeswalker or any individual who has uncovered a new spell from history comes to Strixhaven. Maybe they get a little conversation with a couple of the professors or anything like that, or maybe the librarians of the Biblioplex, and they say, hey, I've got this super cool, powerful spell, or some spell that you guys have not seen before. Let me demonstrate it to you. And since you like to chronicle all of the spells ever known, you might as well put it in the mystical archive. So I feel like maybe that's kind of the conversation that is had when new spells are introduced. Let's see. Okay, so just one final question before we wrap it up here. So, Shank TW, remind me where I can find you on YouTube. Okay, so I am on YouTube at The Lorebrarians, so that's LOREBRARIANS. I try to get about a video every week or two. I'm still going through class currently. So that takes a lot of my time, but I try to get some videos up there. We have a lot of fun, so come check us out for sure. Sweet. And my link apparently is in the chat as well. So I wanted to just take this time now to thank everybody for coming, for listening to my Lorehold lecture, for giving me your attention, and also for coming to the lecture beforehand. That was an amazing lecture, and I hope after today all of you will be Lorehold Mage students, right? It's the best college, Lorehold. So take care, everyone, and have a good rest of your week. Thank you very much.